Head of Public Advocacy, Mustapha. Anas, welcome to the program. I just want to ask you whether you think it's a coincidence that this definition has been refined at a time when the Israel-Gaza conflict is happening and when hundreds of thousands of people are marching across the streets of the UK demanding peace.
Certainly, it's not a coincidence at all. I mean, if you look at the government's own press release, it begins with mentioning how off the back of the 7th of October attacks, that there has been a rise in extremism. So the context is definitely about the genocide that is happening in Gaza and people's response to it. Increasingly, ministers and MPs have come out to describe these marches as being mobs or Islamists, and we've had even former prime ministers talk about an Islamist takeover of Great Britain. So this is all very absurd, very extreme from a government which has a track record of extremism, of Islamophobia, of stoking racism. And Michael Gove, the minister who made the announcement today, is very familiar to that sort of language and that sort of rhetoric. He previously announced a particular nasty plan, which he said that Muslims were trying to take over schools in Birmingham in the United Kingdom, but it ended up all being fabricated based on a fake letter. And this is something that he pushed in order to push further laws that erode our civil liberties, erode our freedoms, and in fact give the state powers to be able to stifle and silence groups that object to its policies, especially its foreign policy.
We've had prominent people talking about no-go zones in certain cities because too many Muslims live there. We've had the former deputy chairman, I say former, of the Tory party, the ruling Conservatives, because he's now left that party and joined another further right party, Lee Anderson, saying that the London mayor, Sadiq Khan, is under the control of extremists. Anas, there's an election coming up. People on the outside just see this as the government trying to whip up some kind of fear amongst people. And I've heard it for myself on BBC Radio, people calling BBC Radio and saying our country is being taken away from us. People are falling for this before an election.
Inciting fears and prejudices against minorities is something that governments have done across the world in order to win elections. I mean, I think Lee Anderson himself mentioned that Muslims are the wedge issue in this current or the upcoming general election. And we're seeing it playing out today with this announcement by Michael Gove. I mean, it's exactly a playbook that has been repeated for the last 20, perhaps even 30 years, and since the war on terror, which many people view as a sort of war on Islam and Muslims, has taken hold of the Western world. And the consequence of this is increasingly authoritarian powers that the state assumes for itself and takes by snatching rights from everyone else. So by inciting fears against Muslims and diverting people's attention, they take your right to free speech, they take your right to protest, they give the police extra rights to be able to arrest you if you challenge them or dissent, and they label you as an extremist for you exercising your democratic rights. So it is why today we've come together with a number of civil society organizations, including Sisters Uncut, Black Lives Matters, and Palestine Action, to reject this announcement and demand that the government, that a total abolition of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism powers that have only ever done harm to our communities here in the UK.
Anas, you know, we could have a heavy intellectual debate. We could look at the social and political consequences of this redefinition. But I just want to take it back to the more basic human level. Those marches that have been happening in London especially, every weekend around the world, but London seems to be bigger than most. And we've shown some pictures, and clearly the majority of people protesting are white people. But it's sometimes the browner-faced people who look like me, who might be Muslim, who are shouting jihad, jihad, jihad. And a lot of conservative politicians are saying that word just shows that these people are extremists. Jihad, of course, means struggle, right? It's a struggle for Islam. But the problem is that those marches are now being called hate marches, as you say. People see the marches for people who want peace and say it's a hate march because there are people who are brown and there are Muslim there. And of course, I'm exaggerating, but as you can hear from my accent, Anas, I'm also British and I'm a Muslim.
That happened on the sidelines of these protests. In fact, the chant that you mentioned happened at a completely different protest, not the main ones that were happening. And they obviously blow this up in the media, wall-to-wall coverage, in order to just push their narrative. And they know very well that these marches are overwhelmingly peaceful, they're overwhelmingly well-mannered, and there's not any sort of violence. In fact, compare this to when Suella Braverman, when she was a Home Secretary and called for the Brits to take their country back and to come and march on the cenotaph, there was violence. There was about 100 far-right protesters and about 80 of them were arrested. And that's the people that the government's trying to whip up against the broader masses of the British population, the fair-minded people who support Gaza, who support the rights of Muslims and reject this government's Islamophobia and xenophobia.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that tallies with what American intelligence agencies say about the US and us, that it's not extremists from any possible Muslim background who are the biggest threat, but it's white supremacists and their far-right ideology that are the biggest threat to domestic security. I've taken it to the US, but I was thinking maybe it's relevant. Anas, Mustapha, thank you so much.